Some women were given higher positions in the ANC under the leadership of Oliver Tambo. You also reflected at the ANC's conference in Kabwe in 1985, the NEC departed from its earlier approach of mobilizing women solely for national liberation and formally recognized that women's equality would deepen and enhance the quality of democracy itself. Please explain the significance of this development.
So this is a really interesting moment, because what comes together are struggles inside the country and struggles in the ANC in exile. And they're all pushing for rethinking the relationship between women's liberation and national liberation. They're thinking outside of the framework that women's role is to go out there and bring in more foot soldiers for national liberation. They're beginning to put sexism on the table. They're beginning to put on the table the gender division of labor, which is the heart of our economy, right? Whose work is counted and whose work is seen to be of lesser value, what kinds of work should be paid for, and which kinds of work are considered to be something you do out of your nurturing responsibilities, right? So they're bringing all those questions into the ANC, and that means that women's liberation must mean something more than just national liberation. So we see a shift away from the fight for a non-racial society to a fight for a non-racial, non-sexist society at Kabwe. And those influences are absolutely crucial, because they relate to the fight for women to have a place in the ANC's decision-making structures. And Tambo is crucial in seeing that there is something wrong in a system in which women don't have formal voice. So he supports that. He also had it's not that he was particularly feminist, but he was a Democrat. So he thought that if women are articulating some unhappiness with the way in which the organizational structures are working, then that should be taken seriously. And if the organization was, I guess in his mind, it was unwittingly marginalizing the voices of certain members, then it should correct that. And he took on the concern that women were presenting. Very famous statements from Tambo that we cannot be free until the women are free, which enabled a conversation. It gave legitimacy to the idea that the struggles of women were not a distraction from the main issue of national liberation. They went to the heart of what liberation for all people would mean. So I think he was a really enabling leader, as a little later on Mandela would be an enabling leader for those voices to be heard. So in the Durban Congress, Mandela also played a role of facilitating a conversation on a quota. And leadership is important. Supportive leadership at the top can be crucial in a movement making these strategic gains at key moments. So yes, Tambo definitely was one of those absolutely core figures.
Despite access to decision-making, the ANC Women's League has not been able to advance clear policy positions strategically through the ANC government. For example, you quote youth activist Vuyiswa Tulelo as saying that in the current period of infighting in the ANC and in the struggle for high office, the ANC Women's League is little more than a bargaining council for quotas. What is your opinion of this?
I think that's a wonderful phrase, a bargaining council for quotas, because what she's captured, and she is, she has a wonderful turn of phrase in general, but what she's captured is this conflation that happens in the Women's League, in which the leaders of the Women's League begin to equate their own advancement with the demands for equality. In other words, they think that as long as ANC Women's League women are in places of authority, they have advanced gender equality, right? So that's what the struggle becomes about. The struggle becomes, for the League, it becomes about how to deploy as many of their trusted members into key positions. And what's lost in that process is an agenda for change. What will those women do when they are actually in power? What kinds of policies are they going to advance? Is there a strategic plan that relates to the interests and the needs of ordinary and particularly poor women who do not have access to parts of the economy, who are carrying the burden of care as well as the burden of being breadwinners, who have to take on all the failures of the state in relation to provision of health services, child support, care of old people, right? It's women who have to worry about how families get fed in a context of poverty. It's women who are the ones who have to fetch water because there isn't piped water coming into the household. So those issues really were not made front and center in the League's policies. It didn't come up with a clear strategic plan that it could say, well, in housing, here is what we want. All they could come up with are targets. So X number of women should be beneficiaries, but without a clear understanding of what the relations of gender are, and particularly how the economy itself is gendered, where women and men are placed in the economy, is very much a function of what is assumed to be the roles of women and men inside families, for example. So no strategic plan, no way of maintaining a relationship with women's movements outside of government, who would push for change. And in fact, to some extent, I would say they were suspicious of those independent women's organizations, right? So yeah, I think that it's a telling phrase. It has been a bargaining council for quotas, by which Vuyiswatilelo means the placement of women that they handpick into leadership positions without an agenda for change. Very much also kingmakers is how they saw themselves as, they still appear to see themselves as really the support base for male leaders. That, to me, is a very thin version of politics.
Sometimes the need for greater gender parity has created an unhealthy dynamic where, for example, unpopular women premiers have been imposed on some provinces. Do you have any view on such issues?
Well, this is true. Thandi Modise, for example, is a case in point. You see how the idea of parity in representation became a convenient argument for displacing some leaders who were male by using gender as the example. It's the reason why they were imposing a woman. Imposing is because they wanted to fulfill the quota, right? But actually underneath it, there's some real politics and jockeying for position. And I think in a way that does set women up to be positioned for failure, because the concern is not with the substantive content of policies. It's with a kind of factionalism inside the ANC. And you know, I don't think this is true of all the quota women. I think there's some very good women who have got into parliament who might not have without a quota. So I'm not opposed to quotas as a strategy. I support affirmative action. I think that you need these kinds of interventions to shake up power structures. But the bottom line is that you must have a set of policies that you want to implement. It cannot be simply about getting in. And as long as it's simply about getting in, then it becomes about pushing deck chairs around on the Titanic. And that's what you see around these factional battles, that it's really has not been about this kind of set of policies versus that. It's much more about who is aligned to different leadership positions. And women are caught up in it to the same extent that men are caught up in it, you know. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong in what the women did. Men do it as well. My concern with all of this jockeying is, where's the agenda for change coming from? Where is the set of policies that are going to be advanced that take account of gender inequalities? And without some theory of addressing inequality, the Women's League, you know, has nothing more to offer than the ANC men do, right?
Finally, you argue that the Women's League was more successful in placing women's issues on the agenda of government's Reconstruction and Development Plan in the 1990s than of its current NDP program. Why do you say this?
Well, in the early 1990s, the League was in alliance with feminists. And it took forward what feminists were demanding in a range of different sectors. To remember, women were quite organized in the early 1990s. They were organized in different sectors. They were in the Reproductive Rights Alliance. They were in the health sector. They were organized in the welfare sector. They were organized in the trade unions. And in all of those sectors, they had clear sets of demands, right? So the League facilitated those demands being made inside the ANC. Around the NDP, the League had become a shell of that kind of organization. It no longer had links into feminist organizations. It was in conflict with some of those organizations because it shared the social conservatism that we see under President Zuma, in which homophobia has become re-established, in which it seems acceptable for leaders to treat women as if they were simply objects for male pleasure, right? So the League, in fact, by siding with Zuma, put itself on the other side of the street from the feminists. And there are consequences to that politics. And part of that is that it doesn't know what it is articulating anymore. So the NDP is a process in which you can barely see an impact.
That was Professor Shireen Hassim discussing her book, The ANC Women's League.